Thank you all. I jotted down a few questions I wanted to ask our panel to help illustrate how complicated NAGPRA is from the perspective of the community itself. And Rosita, you just alluded to or addressed one of the questions that I had, which was, is 100% of your community members or 100% of your community members always in agreement about repatriation? And if not, how does your community handle those internal disagreements? And maybe we can hear from our Pueblo members of the panel about that.
You know, I have the very best job in the world, but I also have the most difficult job. And I always tell you, it's like walking over what, I mean, it's just unbelievable the challenges that I have. But we do have a council of traditional scholars. And we bring these issues before them, and we will, you know, we'll debate them, and sometimes we're, you know, I believe in the young. You know, I really do believe that the young, they, you know, have the right to our culture. And so it's like these shamanic objects where they said we couldn't use them. And our younger people said, no, we want to be able to at least see them. And so we have to go through these kind of discussions, and we end up, you know, with these kind of what we call compromises. But as I said, there are some communities who are totally Christian, or the people who are in power. The people who are in political power will decline to. Do I have it on? Who will decline to pursue repatriation? So there are constant struggles about repatriation, and sometimes some people have said we shouldn't be repatriating because of the kinds of conflict that it does cause. But from my perspective, the benefits to our culture are much greater than some of those challenges. I think we can overcome the challenges if we sit down. We do it all in Tlingit, and we'll have transcribers and translators. We do everything that all of our sessions are conducted in Tlingit because all the deeper meanings are, you know, in the language. And so sometimes we'll have to go back and do the translations of it, and we'll do the transcriptions, do the translations, and then we have to come back and have another meeting where the younger ones and sometimes their managers like myself will come back and meet with the elders to try to figure out how do we make this work for us, you know, in the 21st century. It's a process that seems to work for us. It doesn't resolve all of the conflicts. We did set up our own internal dispute mechanism. We have our own traditional laws, but unfortunately we're not able to enforce our own laws, our traditional laws these days. So we've had to set up these new kinds of mechanisms to resolve traditional culture and clan-based disputes.
Thank you. And how do you guys handle this issue at Tusuki and Acoma?
With us there at Tusuki, we bring everything before the tribal council. And at that point, there are other advisors to the council that it goes through. So even though to repatriate an item or human remains, as said earlier, our unwritten traditional law dictates to us as to how we're going to do that, if we're going to do that. And so it's kind of an awkward situation for us as we move forward regarding repatriation, especially for human remains. Our thought process and our unwritten law is that these remains, these people that were once alive, they were laid to rest where they're at. And we don't have a right to excavate them because of our unwritten traditional law. And sometimes repatriation could be maybe the small finger bone. That's kind of awkward because, you know, what happened to the rest of it? It's really up to the council as to how they're going to take action or not take action. And then the bottom line is always the resources of where, how are we going to house them, what are we going to do. On the lighter note, the 19 pueblos have come together here in the state to address these issues for those smaller tribes that may not have tipos or people taking care of the NAGPRA issues. So in one of the instances, the full 19 are addressing issues over at the Chaco. So there is a committee. I'm part of that committee. There's 5 of us to the north and 5 to the south. And to weed through everything that they're being given before the full 19 pueblos. We report back to our own governors and tribal councils, and they're the ones that give direction as to how we're gonna take action. But overall, again, when it comes to repatriation of items, we have to, again, as said earlier, we want to know as much as we can, but for us to see the actual remains would tell us whether they're native or not, because bones don't talk, and we can't distinguish whether they're Spanish, earlier Europeans and what have you, or Pueblo people, or even Plains Indians that roam, or Navajos. But we treat them the same way. We want to make sure that they were laid to rest in a certain spot, and that's where they need to be back. Again, with the Pueblo Tisuki, we're a Pueblo that really don't share everything under the sun, and there's a reason why we don't do that. Often when I come before folks, I would throw that question back at them as to, you know, how do you distinguish repatriation versus versus your own ethical religion, if you have one. And I always ask the audience, you know, how many of you are Christians? How many of you are Catholics? And the question I would ask is, do you all know how they ordain ministers and priests? I don't know that. But what I'm getting at is that if a group like that won't distinguish or disclose that information, why are you asking the tribes for that information? If you can't even accept the fact that our traditional laws and belief system is a little different. Yes, we're Catholics, but we walk in this, what we call two worlds, the traditional world and the Catholic world. So it's kind of awkward for us as we move forward, but as we're moving forward, per oral history of Tisuki Pueblo, we know of certain sites, we know of where burials are, and even up to the point where who is buried there. That's as far as we know. It's all oral. Because as the previous councils before, when this issue came up, they decided back then not to put anything in writing. for fear of somebody looting, doing all that stuff. So when it comes down to the decision makers, it's all to the tribal council. And as the tribal council works, of course, we always ask former governors and former war chiefs that were on the council their advice. But the majority of the time, the question is always, do we repatriate or not? And again, we always look back at the museums, the national parks, or others that are wanting to do this, that we get enough information so we can make that determination. And again, for the 19 pueblos, we do have a group that does that. In certain tribes, over the years, they either lost their traditional ways, and now we rely on 4 or 5 tribes to do the repatriation for the whole group. This way, there's not 19 individual, as was spoken earlier. They may be all affiliated, but if we do it as a group, we're all assured that, they're going back to their resting place. So, food for thought.
To answer TJ's question, on a good day, do we have 100% consensus? Yes. In a utopian world. I think if you ask any Pueblo or tribal community whether they reach 100% consensus on whether to repatriate or make a claim, you will fundamentally hear them answer yes. It's when you get into the nitty-gritty of actually finding out the details of these remains, and of course, we're talking about human remains, but there are a whole variety of different categories of what could be claimed by a tribal or Pueblo community. And those, as Rosita alluded to, can also be sacred objects or funerary objects. Objects of cultural patrimony, and sometimes those objects come back to a community or are presented to a community in the sense that a community is being asked to whether these items or objects are of significance to a community. Are they important? Is there enough information there for a community to make a claim for those particular objects? And some of those objects come with a long story of at what point did they leave the community to begin with? What is that ball of wax or ball of yarn that you have to untangle to understand how did these items leave the community in the first place? In terms of objects of cultural patrimony, who gave the authorization for these items to leave the community when the community as a whole, as a collective, owns those items? You may have items that are contaminated by preservation efforts of well-meaning individuals that remain in institutions that can't be brought back or put into use. They can't be, as often many communities will allude to, these items are living. They have spirits, they breathe, they need to be fed. But when the community can no longer, or the practitioners can no longer handle those items for fear of the pesticides and the chemicals that were used to preserve them may actually cause harm to them, or if a community decides to reinter those items, the possibility that those contaminants may leach into the ground, or worse, leach into our water systems if there's a number of them. What is the potential for that? So once you get into the details of some of these objects or human remains, you start to see that 100% consensus start to break down a little bit. Acoma is very fortunate to have, with the Historic Preservation Office, an advisory board which is made up of members of our religious societies. Individuals who represent and come from those societies are meant to advise and guide the director of Acoma's Historic Preservation Office about what should actually be claimed, what should actually be repatriated, and what is the final method of disposition for those items. Acoma is also very fortunate in that we have an institution there at the Pueblo. Some of you have visited our Acoma Visitor Center and Museum. That institution has a fully functioning archive in the basement area. And it was created with the idea that as Acoma repatriated certain objects of patrimony, cultural items, that there could be a place for those items to reside, so that they didn't reside in institutions in which our people had no means to visit or see, that these items could be fed if they needed to be spiritually fed, or that our own young people, or even our elders, our potters, our weavers could come and see some of those items, to see items that were made by our own people's hands. And we're very fortunate that we have that institution. But many communities don't have institutions like that. And so we come to that question of, is there 100% consensus? And from the outside, I would dare say that yes, we probably have 100% consensus at the outset, but as we go through the process, it can take you down very many possibilities. But at the end, once we have explored every single one of those pathways, I think what is important, and I've worked with not only TJ and Governor Mitchell on several projects, I think it's the discussion that becomes very important for a community, to have those conversations about what then is the ultimate solution that they're going to come up with, and what then is the consensus going to be, especially when you have multiple tribes making a claim, multiple claims for remains, or perhaps multiple claims for an item. We have been very fortunate here in the Southwest that our Pueblo communities have supported one another and have worked together, especially on items that have had multiple claims on them. So that's my long answer to a short question.
Thank you. It's such a complicated process, NAGPRA is, and actually we talk about NAGPRA and repatriation often as if they're synonymous terms, but there are two federal laws mandating repatriation: the National Museum of the American Indian Act in 1989, NAGPRA in 1990, and then each state has its own burial protection law. So the way it operates in New Mexico is different than the way it operates in Arizona and Colorado and Utah and so forth and so on. And so I watch over the last 26 years, I've watched a number of young tribal members come into positions within their tribe in which they've been responsible for repatriation. And so my question is, given that each museum has a policy, given that the museum has two very different policies for one museum, and this multiplicity of federal and state laws, how do you as individuals, and how does your tribe just grapple with all of that complexity technically, and then also putting the technical framework in application to your cultural beliefs?
With Tisuki, we when we first went down this road to repatriate, this museum told us you have to abide by our policies, which meant that we had to pretty much show and tell when, how these items were used, by who they were used by, and when they were used by, what time of the year they were used. I mean, all the details. And at that point, and I know the previous councils, you know, that's when they kind of turned a deaf ear to that museum. The heartaches that the elders went through regarding the repatriating of these items is where we ended up just letting the museum know that yes, we claim them, they're Tsuki, and no, we don't want you to display them in any exhibit unless we give the authorization. And at this point, the Pueblo said we weren't going to authorize anything. And we had to go into a MOU, a memorandum of understanding, between the Pueblo and that museum, so that we can determine at a later date how to negotiate their policy, because it didn't, what they were asking of us was everything under the sun. And we felt that that was inappropriate. We were just trying to follow the NAGPRA law, but again, their own policies internally dictated to them as to how they were going to go about doing this. So those items are still with that museum to this day, and we constantly call and make sure that yes, we don't have how would I say the ability to bring them, to take them because of the funding issues. And again, if they were to change their policies, and to date, that was back in, I want to say, maybe about a year after this NAGPRA law was passed in '91, and they're still there. So just to give you an idea that those are some of the obstacles that we faced. No, that's just one museum. We've went to several others, and their point of view was pretty much the same. And that's for Tsuki, but and I don't know how the rest of the tribes are dealing with museums and their internal policies, but that's what we faced. And we've gone through, I think, 2 or 3 directors up there at their museum, and so we're hoping that maybe in another 10 years that we'll be able to bring them home. But up to now, the good thing about that is that that museum is honoring the MOU that we've sat with them across the table, and that's the good thing. Because if they didn't honor it, I'm pretty sure these items will be out on the exhibit floor and what have you. But they honored it, so that's a plus for us, and we're still trying to work through the red tape to see if they're willing to let go of their internal policies so that we can bring them home. But up to now, that's what we're facing.
I think there is a complexity when we talk about these policies and laws that occur in multiple states in which tribes have ancestral cultural affiliation to. For example, for my office, when I was working for the Pueblo of Acoma, part of keeping tabs on our places of cultural affiliation meant that not only was I working in the state of New Mexico, it meant that I was moving over to Arizona, up to Colorado, and over into Utah. So constantly being on at the top of your game, so to speak, knowing what was moving in 4 different states, because you had the community had cultural affiliation or ancestral lands at one time, long before the states were ever created. So keeping tabs on those and knowing who was in office and knowing what policies were being moved or state reburial acts were being moved, and knowing that not all of them were on the same level of being completed, forces tribal communities to operate at a different level. And having agencies and state agencies and institutions understand that tribes are having to cover such large areas of interest to them, of concern to them, took some understanding and some explaining that we just weren't dealing with one specific institution's request for information. We were having to cover multiple ones. And in the case of certain communities like Hopi, who has expanded their cultural affiliation to much wider realms, they are being inundated with multiple requests to consult. But part of the complexity of some of these laws and processes, and what I want to bring up here, that while I have these wonderful folks sitting here with me who probably recall this, is during the part of process when a tribe is making a claim for human remains or these items of sacred items and objects, is often the tendency during this process for communities then to put forth cultural information or historical information that may not be, that may be in actual conflict to another tribe. And what do you do as the agency, or what do you do as the institution to begin to sort out whose claim or affiliation is stronger? And when somebody's or some community's interpretation of who got there first is actually in conflict. And I'll bring this example up. We have the example with the National Park Service where Hopi disputed Navajo's claim of affiliation. The Pueblos also disputed the claim of affiliation by Navajo for human remains and cultural objects. So what do you do as the institution, as the federal agency, to sort that out? Because by law, the federal agency has to listen to Navajo and the information that they present. Is there a preponderance of information that supports their claim? Is there a scientific research, historical information that supports that claim? What is then the claim that the Pueblos, or in this case, Hopi, also presents? And what happens then if those are in conflict? Oftentimes when we go through this process, and what I caution the agency and my tribal brothers to be wary of, is a tendency to move towards a pan-Indian origin story of sorts, that our goal of reaching completion for a project forces us almost to build consensus to say, this is our origin story. Well, can a project be defined as successful if there are multiple origin stories, and if those multiple origin stories actually conflict with one another? Is that not success? But we like things when they're nice and neat, and we don't like things when they're messy and put us in conflict with each other. And so giving the practitioners of NAGPRA, the agencies and the institutions, the archaeologists, the anthropologists, what have you, the tools to get through the process and be okay when there's conflict is very key. Because what we don't want to do is go into communities and rewrite their history or their cultural origin stories for them. That's not what the intent of this is to do. The intent is, let's listen to all the lines of evidence that are there, what the tribal communities present, and let's use that to move us through the process for a claim. But there's nothing written in there that gives you the tools to say, okay, what happens when all of those things are in conflict? And sometimes they don't end up as pretty as we would like them to be. And Rosita, through her experience, has heard when it gets to her level, when she, as the chairwoman of the NAGPRA Review Committee, would hear these disputes in Indian country, and what do we do with it when it gets to that level? And I'm sure TJ, in his experience as being the archaeologist, helping to go through the process, what do you do when you start to see these things evolve?
Thank you. An hour has already gone by, and we are going to move to some question and answer period briefly. But before we do that, I have a final question for the panel, and then one request for Rosita to tell us about a case in Alaska. But the question I have for the panel is when I worked for the Pueblo of Zuni in the 1970s, and the tribe made it known that they wanted to recover their ahayuta, which anthropologists refer to as war gods, some private collectors understood why the tribe was requesting those to be returned, and took it upon themselves to send back an ahayuta in an unmarked package, and it was opened up in the tribal offices by the clerical staff, who are not spiritually prepared to see this object or touch it. It created a great crisis that day within the tribe, because how do you do this? They had to send out for the right religious leaders and have a ritual done for the person who had been exposed to this. And so my question is this for the panel: when a private collector wants to return something to your tribe, what's the process for them to do that?
For the Pueblo of Tisuki, when a private collector wants to return items back to the tribe, of course we would ask, are you sure this is Tisuki? That's the first question we ask. And the second question is, where did you obtain it? How long did you have it? So that we're not taking another Tewa Pueblo's item. That's the reason why we're asking these questions. And because some Tewa Pueblos and Tisuki is Tewa, some of the items, and in this case it was more of the pottery style, and the answer was it was obtained through records. We have them dated back to the early 1800s that somebody came through purchasing pottery and what have you. So the pottery and items of that type of item, the Pueblo will go through its process by identifying the individual, who, what, where, when, and why, and then accept the private collectors, and then we give them a receipt in return so that they have records that they returned it to the tribe. Other items, cultural items and other items of that, we did not accept a few for the main reason, as stated earlier, is that there are other Tewa Pueblos that those things might have belonged to. So in a case like that, we've reached out to the other tribes and asked, this was brought to us, this is the person's info. But I know as far as those types of items at Tisuki, we have never accepted them. Other tribes might have, but as far as we're concerned, again, as stated earlier, these items, per our unwritten law, we have to abide by those certain things that is taught to us. So with that, those are the only things that Tisuki has faced so far, amongst other things. But as we move forward into dealing with these types of private collectors coming forward, I think we would be more acceptable to the items, so long as the table pueblos get together and figure out who it all belonged to before Tsuki says, yeah, it's all ours. I think there's a belief system behind it, and we don't want to upset that process. And I guess our philosophy is that we look at the whole world as one, and we wonder why things are happening throughout the world in a negative sense. And we always pray that whatever is going on across the seas and wherever human life is in danger, that it all stop. And I think it starts at this level. And that's our philosophy as we move forward, hoping that, that mankind can, as someone said earlier, open their eyes to see what's out there, and this is just a small piece of it. So.
Acoma has a similar process to the Pueblo of Tsuki. I think our main concern is when approached by an individual or a collector is to ensure that the item really is affiliated with Acoma. We have a lot of folks who will bring in items assuming that they belong to Acoma, when in fact they actually are affiliated with another Pueblo community, and so we'll direct them to the respective community that they need to go see. We do also internally at the preservation office there at Acoma have an internal mechanism in which to begin recording our interactions with individuals via email, letter, phone call, photographs, what have you, to also then do some research into what those items may be, what their background is, and determine also if their acquisition was of a legal or illegal nature, giving us an idea of what path to pursue with those items. More so now, what the Pueblo has seen, at least when I was in office, we had 3 instances where items were being mailed back to the community anonymously. And in one instance, I had a large box that was placed in front of my office door. Somebody just came and left it there. And oftentimes I realize that other institutions also get some similar experiences where people have had bad karma from taking things or acquiring things, and they just want to get them off their hands. Or when people, when it is the estate of an individual who has passed, the people who remain behind don't know what to do with these things. Or we may find things that I've had human skulls people have kept in their office drawers for whatever reason, and people don't know what to do with it, and so they'll come back to the Pueblo and say, this was in my dad's drawer all these many years. What do I do with this? Do you want it? So we're faced with numerous examples of people who are just wanting to get rid of things, but we can't be the repository for everything that people want to get rid of, because that's not what we do. But we want to look at things from a spiritual, ethical, moral place and give closure, not only to people who are returning things, but also give closure to those things that people are bringing back. And so we have to do our due diligence, as a former tribal leader used to always say, to do our due diligence, that we are doing justice to these things and ensuring that, as the former governor alluded to, that we are keeping things in balance in the spiritual world.
I wanted to just first preface my remarks by saying that I have noticed a change in museum professionals, in archaeologists, where they're much more sympathetic or understanding of Native American beliefs. I said that when we first enacted NAGPRA, they said it was a balance between science and Native Americans. But I could tell you it wasn't. We would have knockdown, drag-out fights, with my colleagues at the Smithsonian, and, over the law. But I will tell you that I have noticed a difference in people's attitudes, their understanding, their willingness, to acknowledge Native American beliefs. I have noticed that. And I've noticed it with collectors. But sometimes, collectors have invested large amounts of money into their collections. And more recently, I was contacted by one and said, I'd really like to return this warrior's helmet to you. And I had actually tried to stop the auction when it went up for auction. In fact, we write letters to every auction house when we see our objects coming up on the auction and say, "This, you are selling this illegally, it belongs to us, please return it to us." And of course we only had one success, I think once, where a foundation actually purchased an object for us because we had made it such an issue with a museum in France. But I met with this collector and he said, "I'd really like to return it, but I've made this large investment." And I said, "Well, there's just no way that I'm going to be able to pay you the $2 million for that clan hat." And he says, "Well, I know you can't do that." And so we started working on a process that we thought might be beneficial to himself and ourselves. And so right now we have in Congress a tax credit legislation. And it was a resolution, that we brought to the National Congress of American Indians. They approved it, so it is right now in Congress, where we're hoping, that there would be tax credit to the collector. But in addition to that, I know that still will not take care of the value to the collector. So we have started we're trying to start what we call a sacred objects fund, where and this is something that although we have this resolution that was passed at the National Congress of the American Indian, we don't have a lot of tribes or nonprofits that are stepping up, to start this nonprofit, to start the Sacred Objects Fund. So we have said that we would start to do that. I have to tell you, we haven't been successful other than the idea of it yet. But I still think, that there's hope out there. More recently, an object came up for sale on eBay. And immediately, all my tribal members, I got about 20 emails at 6 o'clock in the morning and said, there's this object for sale, a Chilkat robe for sale on eBay. And I said, okay, we'll see what we could do. So I came into the office and I told my COO, call the guy and tell him that we will give him his minimal bid. And I didn't think it would work. And the guy, agreed to it. And I will tell you, he said he had a flood of phone calls from museums and collectors because they wanted this Chilkat robe. And I immediately called all my friends and said, guys, I need to raise, I think it was $13,000. That was the bottom he had for it. And it's low for a very old Chilkat robe, one of the finest I have ever seen. And we raised the money. And I didn't know if I was going to raise the money or not. I just acted like I had it. And I raised it. And so the guy sold it to us. And then we had this ceremony because, we believe that they have spirits that are associated with these objects. So we had this ceremony, this coming home ceremony for it. And one of the donors came to our ceremony and said, I thought you were just trying to get an old piece of art back home. And she said, I get it. I get why it's so meaningful to you. So I think, I think that we are on a cusp of change. I like to think that we are. I'm hopeful that, that the things that this tax credit may go forward, that maybe we're going to be successful with the Sacred Objects Fund. Maybe the Secretary of Interior, she's written to the French museums and said, you're selling a lot of sacred objects. We need to figure out how to make this work for Native Americans. So I think things are changing, and I feel optimistic about it. want to reach out to her.
I will. And one last question I'm going to ask to Rosita before we turn it over to the audience for some questions. And that's, and I just have to ask Rosita to talk about this because when I teach about repatriation at the University of Arizona, there are two models for repatriation. One is Kennewick Man. Everyone knows about Kennewick Man and how that ended up in court, and the scientists were prevented from doing research, and the court case itself cost more than $2 million, and it was expensive and resulted in bad feelings between scientists and the native communities. And the other model is On Your Knees Cave, which I'm going to ask Rosita to talk about just briefly so everyone knows about this.
Thank you. A number of years back, a human remain was found in a cave on Prince of Wales Sound. There's a cave, On Your Knees Cave, we called it. And one of the things that we like to do right away is when archaeologists come into our country, anthropologists come into our country, we like to educate them right away. And we like to establish good relationships with them. And we established good relationship with the archaeologists on POW. And they understand NAGPRA, they understand that they're supposed to have consultation. So they actually stopped the scientific work when they found these human remains. They contacted the tribes, and we immediately, called our tribal members, the leaders together and said, what do we want to do? They deferred to us because we didn't know whose tribe it belonged to, whose clan he was a member of, and so we at the regional level took over, and we started to confer with some of the elders, and they said, oh, of course it's one of our ancestors, and we have 4 core cultural values. One is Hashuka, and Hashuka means our ancestors. And we're tied to our ancestors, but we also have an obligation to our future generations. And so we said that this human had offered himself to us to learn more about him and the time period. We've said that we always lived in Southeast Alaska since time immemorial. And I remember we had a region-wide historic sites meeting. And one of the younger guys, one of the younger tribal members started to get up there and holler at the archaeologists, when is enough enough? When are you guys going to stop? And one of the elders jumped up and said, no, this is one of our elders, one of our ancestors, and this ancestor has offered himself to us to learn more about our history. So we agreed to, in the consultation, and consultations are really important, we agreed to allow scientific study. And the elder had said, we have lived here since time immemorial. And we know that scientific data may be able to help us determine that scientifically. This is one of the things about NAGPRA, where it recognizes, it says oral traditions have, are given validity. And I know they say you can't date oral traditions. We kind of think we can. And, some of our vocabulary talks about, climate change, when the world tilted. There's lots of things in our oral traditions, and that's another project that I'd like to do, is date some of our oral traditions with some of the scientific things that we're finding. But we ended up in it. It was a great process, working with the archaeologists, with the federal government, with the scientists there, and tribal members. And in the end, we allowed the scientific studies, and then we filed a claim for disposition to have our ancestor return, and we held a ceremony, and we made a gravestone, and we said he was born some 10,000 years ago and died some 30 years ago. So it was a success. So, and we did a film on it. So.